Happy Monday, everybody. It is Monday Morning Quarterback episode 215. Tonight we are going to continue our series with shocks, and we're going to dive into detail about shock bleed, what it is, why it's so important, and what it looks like on the graph, and different ways to do shock bleed. But before we get to that, weather's changing, and for a lot of us that means the season's over or it's wrapping up. And what should you do with those shocks to make sure that they're ready to go for next season? So we typically recommend 20 to 25 races before they get freshened. If you're getting close to that threshold, they should go back to your shock tuner. If that's us, great. Make sure your name and contact info is in the box. We'll get them freshened up and back to you. If you recently, had an accident and had them serviced, or had them serviced and haven't ran, but a dozen races or so, make sure you get them off your car and you keep them in a climate-controlled environment. The last thing you should do is keep shocks hanging in a trailer that's going to be outside, especially, unless you're in Florida or California where it doesn't get super cold. Here in the Midwest and the East Coast, you don't want those shocks to sit in a trailer that's going to be outside and potentially at freezing or below temperatures. And the main reason is it's really hard on the seals, so it'll make your wiper and your shaft seal harden up, and the shock will potentially weep oil either in your trailer or the first time you go to use it. So get those things out, keep them in a climate-controlled environment, so when the time comes to sling some dirt next year, your shocks are ready to go. So without further ado, we'll dive into tonight's topic and come back. Thanks for tuning in again this week. We're going to talk about shock bleed. So last week we talked about shock tuning with shim stack, and we'd mentioned if you really want to change the low speed, you would look at the bleed. So there's a couple different ways shock manufacturers do bleed. So either bleed shims or a bleed hole in the main piston, and that will allow the shock to bleed by on both compression and rebound. So keep in mind, if you're going to increase the size of the bleed hole on this guy, it is going to bleed more on compression and rebound. Now there are certain pistons, our modular piston assembly, it has independent bleed. So a little bit different looking piston. We'll show you what one of those looks like, but on that piston we have bleed shims, and we can increase bleed on just the compression or just the rebound. There's other manufacturers that do it similar or slightly different ways. But for this exercise, we're just going to go out and measure what size hole that is in the piston. Can't make it smaller, but we can make it bigger. So we'll increase bleed and show you what it does to our graph. All right, so measured this. This has a 30 thou bleed hole. You can either check them with a pin gauge set if you have one of those, or with the drill bit itself. So to not walk to the machine shop and get a pin gauge set, I can see that a 30 thou drill bit just goes through this. So we're going to increase it to a 40 thou just to actually show you a change. Typically when we're doing bleed, we would go up to a 35 thou just because if you go too big and you want to go smaller, you got to change the piston. So we found that this little Dremel drill press does the trick really well. So aluminum goes through it really easy. We buy fancy drills, so that's all it takes to go from a 30 to a 40. Now sometimes there'll be 2 or 3 bleeds in this shock, and when we get back to the dyno, I'll explain what the different bleeds would do. So we got that piston with the 40 thou bleed hole back installed on the shaft. We'll put that shock back together, get on the dyno, show you what it did. A couple things I wanted to bring up when we're talking about shock bleed. So that particular piston had one hole, and when you start to get up to that 40, 50, 60 thousandths hole, that hole is going to bleed for a long time. And what I mean by that is, you can imagine, to exaggerate, with a hole this big, as the shaft velocity picks up, fluid can still flow through that large hole. When you have a little bitty hole, when the shaft velocity gets to a certain point, fluid physically can't flow through that hole, and it technically chokes off the bleed, and the bleed becomes not a part of the equation anymore. So oftentimes, depending on how long we want the shock to bleed for, that's going to determine whether we go with multiple smaller holes or one larger hole. The one larger hole is going to make the shock more plush feeling. You'll get a little more movement, you'll have more bleed, and it'll carry out longer, where smaller holes and more of them, you can get the same bleed effect at very low speed, but it will choke off much quicker. And then I'd mentioned earlier, like our modular piston, where we have a main piston and we have interchangeable pieces that go in it. That style of piston we do with bleed shims, and we can change bleed independent of each other, compression and rebound. If you just needed to add compression bleed or take bleed away from the rebound, that's a really good way to do it. All right, so we just ran this thing through its paces, and you can see we were the blue graph and now we are the orange graph. Okay, and it is a little bit softer through the whole range. Probably the biggest area where it changed was like 1.5, so we softened it about 5 pounds on compression, 7 pounds on rebound. When you get out here to the high speed, you see that difference isn't as much. 4 pounds and 4 pounds, so a little more adjustment at low speed. And especially I like to think about that as a percentage. So it adjusted 7 pounds at 53 pounds, so that's a pretty big change, versus the 4 pounds it adjusted at 160 on the high speed. So so that's what adding bleed to a shock does, and that's one of the more pronounced adjustments for driver feel. So a lot of times when we're trying to isolate a feel for a driver, it can be bleed changes. So now if we wanted to get that 3-inch back up, we didn't want to lose that 7 pounds on rebound. As we were adding bleed, we could have went up a little bit on one of the later shims in the stack, one of the not as powerful shims, and that could have got our 3-inch back up but kept our 1-inch down. All right, hope you guys got something from that. As always, if you have any questions pertaining to what we're talking about tonight, or past, present, anything, why the Saints suck so bad, shoot me a comment. Happy to answer those for you. That kind of helps drive our questions. Thanks for tuning in. Hope you guys have a great week. If you're still getting to do some racing, good for you, and good luck this weekend.